Emphasis in treatment was also placed on helping Mark connect with the paradoxical consequences of his avoidance behavior. And in particular, the role of that avoidance behavior in the worsening of his PTSD symptom, and also the generalization of Mark's fear response to other stimuli. So early on in treatment, in addition to providing psychoeducation on PTSD, we also provided psychoeducation around avoidance and the consequences of avoidance. However, I also wanted to be very mindful of ensuring that this psychoeducation didn't evoke or increase the shame that Mark was experiencing. And so we discussed how this avoidance makes tremendous sense, given the circumstances of his traumatic event. So for example, just as we quickly remove our hand from a stove when it is hot, we also are very motivated as human beings, just like any other animal, to avoid other sources of pain, including emotional pain. It is a biological response that is part of all of us, to where we are motivated to avoid pain. And in a situation like this, however, where it was important for Mark to really take a look at the emotions that he was experiencing so that essentially he could get to the other side of them, he was very motivated to get that short-term relief, which of course is a very basic human need. However, in this situation, it's having these paradoxical consequences for Mark, where it is further increasing the distress and worsening his PTSD symptoms. So that avoidance comes at a cost. His emotions were becoming much more intense and frequent. He was also experiencing this beliefs that he was unable to effectively regulate or modulate his emotions. And the more that he avoided and the more that he tried to get away from these emotions that were aversive or challenging to him, it reduced his tolerance for those experiences to the point where even just a small amount of anxiety or guilt that he was experiencing was something that motivated an avoidance response. Also talked with Mark about how much effort that he was putting into trying to get away from something that was going to be impossible to get away from. And so we talked about the cost of the emotional avoidance with regard to how it's impacted different areas of his life. So not just the fact that it was increasing his emotional distress, but it was also affecting his relationships with others, that it was reducing his confidence in his ability to return to work. It was impacting his sleep, and so on. So even though those strategies were working in the moment, that relief was short-lived, and it came at a tremendous cost in the sense of it impacting the extent to which he was living a life that he valued, that he found meaningful, a life where he felt like he was effective. And trying to convey the paradoxical consequences of emotional avoidance, I leaned on a lot of metaphors here to convey the consequences of trying to get away from experiences that are essentially impossible to get away from. So one of my favorite metaphors to use is the tug-of-war metaphor. So you could imagine that you are in a tug-of-war with this hideous monster, which essentially is all of your internal experiences that you don't want to have. And between you and that monster is this giant chasm. And your goal here is to win this battle, to win this tug-of-war, and pull that monster into that chasm. Because if you're able to do that, then those experiences will end and you can go about living your life. However, that monster is much bigger than you. And no matter how much effort you put into trying to win that battle, the monster is always going to pull back harder. So just as in any kind of tug-of-war battle, as soon as you pull a little bit on the rope, the other side is going to pull back harder. And that's essentially what's happening when we try to avoid our internal experiences. And because that monster is bigger than us, it essentially is going to win this battle. There's no way that we are going to get that monster into the chasm. And so the solution here is not to try to find some way to win this battle, but recognize that this is a battle that we cannot win, and essentially dropping the rope. It means that those experiences are going to be there. It means that we are going to encounter emotional pain. However, by not picking up that rope, it reduces our contact with those experiences and reduces the extent to which those experiences take up all of our time and effort. If we let go of that rope, that monster is still going to be there, but now we can focus our energy on living the life that we want to live, that we can essentially focus our energy on being effective and doing things that are meaningful to us. Part of this process of switching from unwillingness to willingness with Mark was having him monitor those times in which he engaged in unwillingness, made a choice to be unwilling, and what was the cost of that. So here we conceptualize willingness and unwillingness as a behavior. You can feel very unwilling, and yet you can still act willing. It's all or nothing. And so we wanted Mark to recognize what were the consequences of being unwilling, as well as what were the benefits of his willingness. In addition, through this work, my hope was also to address some of his negative beliefs about emotions. So we provided psychoeducation on emotions as well, that emotions are there for a reason. It's essentially our body's way of communicating with us. You can kind of think of it as this liaison between our environment and our brain. It gives us information, and this is important information. It can help us determine how we might act in certain types of situations. And if we try to avoid or push down those experiences or view them as being harmful, then essentially what happens is that our body is going to turn up the volume because it wants us to get this information. If we're willing to take a look at our emotions, we recognize that they can have utility. Our emotions typically will not last very long. As soon as we get that information from an emotion, it might dissipate and reduce in intensity. And ultimately, Mark is in control of his behavior. That even with intense emotions or even with unpleasant thoughts, Mark ultimately had control over the actions that he took. He may not be able to control his emotions or his thoughts, however, he can control his behavior. And so a lot of this work was focused on how can Mark be most effective in the face of emotional distress or other difficult internal experiences. And through those actions, this could be seen as a strength. As Mark gained more experience in doing things that were maybe counter to those intense emotions, or at least counter to these urges to avoid, that self-efficacy could increase.